Hi there, welcome to this free Angular course in which we will be creating Movie Night, the application to not only view particular movie information, but also add new information like so. We'll be using json-server to have a sort of API/database for this. It'll simply just be a JSON file, but we'll be learning a lot about Angular 8 and of course the various different features such as routing using something called a behavior subject with RxJS, observables, and much more. So I hope you find this useful, and of course you can find the information about this and much more over at developer.school. Thanks a lot for watching. Let's jump in by creating our first Angular application. So our journey starts here inside of the command line. We'll need to have Node.js installed. You can check that with node-v or npm-v. If none of these commands work for you, you'll have to go over to nodejs.org and install Node. Then after that, we can say npm install @angular/cli-g. This will install the latest version of the Angular CLI on your machine and it will expose it globally. So let's hit enter to install that. You may need to give it a minute, so now would be a great time to go ahead and get a cup of coffee. The Angular CLI has now installed on my machine, so I can say ng new and we'll call this movie night. So this will go ahead and create a brand new Angular project using the Angular CLI, and it will be called Movie Night. It's going to ask us whether we want to add routing. Let's hit yes, and for the style sheet we'll want to use SCSS. This will now go ahead and create that Angular project and install the dependencies. We can now cd into Movie Night. And after that, we can open this up inside of Visual Studio Code or an editor of your choice, and then say ng serve. When we say ng serve, this will of course start our project on localhost 4200. We can then open it up and of course see that inside of the browser. Let's hit enter. This now gives us an Angular application that we can see here on screen. We'll start off by heading over to the terminal, and from within the terminal we'll use the Angular CLI to generate a module. Let's say ng-gm for ng generate module. We'll call this module movie. So a module can be thought of as a sort of collection of components, so features that all belong together in that circumstance, and we'll be using Angular to sort of lazy load this module. We can then cd into source app, and from within here movie, and then we can say ng-gc for ng generates component, and we want to generate the MovieList component. When we do that, you'll see that it creates a component and also updates the movie module. Inside of our app routing module, we can now go ahead and define some routes. So let's, at the same time here, open up some braces, and we'll say when the path is empty, we want to redirect to the movies path, and we want to make sure that we have path match full on that. And then we can now add a path for movies, and we'll say load children, and this will allow us to load all of the module by making a new function and then saying import /movie/movie.module. Then we have a then m, and we can return m.movie module. So this is known as differential loading, and it's a new feature inside of Angular 8, or rather a new way of defining routes at that point. And I understand at this moment in time you may feel a little confused as to what exactly we're doing at this point, but just stick with it and it'll all slot together. So right now we want to go over to this movies path. So we'll now need a movies routing module. So let's make a movie routing.module.ts. And then we'll copy the app routing module. Now we could have added the -- routing flag when we generated that module, and it would have made a routing module for us. But for now we'll simply copy this over and we'll call this movie routing module. This time we don't want these paths. We want to say that when we're on the sort of root path, which will be movies in this circumstance, we want to load the component MovieList component. So we'll have to make sure inside of our movie module that we have that component in what's known as the declarations. And we do. Next, inside of our app component.html, we want to delete everything here and instead provide what's known as a router outlet. The router outlet will navigate us to /movies, but we haven't imported the movie routing module into the imports of our movie module. As well as that, we also have a slight mistake, and right now we have for root on this router module. We want to say for child. So this specifies that the movie list is a child route, or rather everything inside of this module is a child route. For the app routing module, we're saying router module.forRoot, and that allows us to specify the root routes. So now you can see that we have movie list works, and that's because effectively we're at /movies, as you can see at the top in our URL bar. So all of this has just been setting up the routes to make it so we're at /movies. We didn't have to do any of this technically. We could have just gone ahead and added it to the app routing module and not used lazy loading, but you may have come from an Angular 7.x or below background, and I wanted to show you something called differential loading with load children. Now that we have that, let's open up our terminal once again, and we'll go back now to the root of the project, and inside of here we'll set ngGC for generating a component, and we'll call this component the navbar component. This will create a navbar component and we'll add it to the app module. We don't need to lazy load this component, we can simply add it as part of our app module. So we don't want to add this to movies, we want to make sure we add that to the app module. Now if we go to the app component, we can add the app navbar above the router outlet. Now you can see that we have navbar works and movie list works at the same time. This will allow us to have a navbar on the screen as well as our movie content. Inside of the navbar component.html, we can add a nav element, and inside of the nav element we can have a h1. We'll simply call this navbar for now, or even home, and we'll hit save. So now we can see that we have home. In the navbar component.scss, we'll add some styles for our navbar. So let's say nav, and we'll have a background. I'm going to paste in a gradient right here. And when we do that, we can see we have this padding and margin around the navbar element. So we'll need to go to the styles.scss, and we'll simply say HTML body and main. We'll have padding of 0, margin of 0. We'll have box sizing of border box, and at the same time, we'll also declare a star for before, and the same for after. And then we'll say box sizing inherit by default. We'll also set a background color equal to a sort of greeny black. And when we hit save, we can see that we now have this navbar. We can then either globally or inside of the navbar itself simply add 0 margin and padding on our h1 for now. We can also set the color equal to white, and we can add some padding to our nav element itself. Inside of our styles.scss, we can set the font family to. We'll simply set that to Apple System and a variety of others. So here we have a very standard nav bar. We can then, inside of main, go ahead and add a max width of maybe 920 pixels. We can change that in the future if we want. We'll set the margin to 0 auto, and we'll set the color equal to white. For any list item elements, we'll set list style to none. And for our A elements, we'll set the color equal to an orange. Inside of our app component.html, we can put main around our router outlet. We can specify that this would be the main content area. Now we can see we have that white colored text. So now that we have the movie list works on screen, let's look at starting to display some content. Inside of the movie folder, let's now make a models folder, and that models folder can contain a movie.model.ts. Now we could put our movie list inside of a components folder if you want. For now we'll worry about that later. And for now we'll have an export interface of a movie, and this will be a description of what our movie will look like. So we'll have an ID, which will be a number, We'll have a name equal to a string, a genre of a string, an image of a string, and a release year of a string as well. So your release year could be a number, your ID could be a string, and so on. It doesn't really matter too much about this, just have some very basic data. We're now going to build a movie service to get some movies. So open up your terminal and we'll go over to source, and from within here, app, then movies, or rather movie, and then from within of this movie directory we'll say nggs for ng generate service, and we'll call the service movie. We can also put that inside of a services/movie. So we now have this services folder with the movie service inside, and inside of this movie model.ts folder I'm going to paste in some movies. So you can get this from the article over at Developer School, but at the same time you can also just add your own. So I've just added some movies right here, such as ID 1, name of the Terminator, genre of sci-fi, an image, and a release year. If we head over to our movie service, we can make a function called getMovies, and we can return of movies. So we'll need to import movies from the movie.model and of from RxJS. You don't need to install anything here. RxJS comes by default with Angular. This will simply be enough right now to give us a list of movies as an observable. We'll look at this in a moment when we head over to, firstly, make sure that you save the file, and then head over to the MovieList component.html. We'll remove the MovieList works, and we'll add an unordered list, and then a list item, and we'll say *ng4 let movie of movies, and on the UL here we'll say *ngIf. So as you can imagine, this ngIf is if we have some movies, then we'll show this. If not, don't add this to the DOM. And then here on the list item, we're saying ng4. So this will copy paste effectively, adding new items to the DOM that match this template of li based on the list of movies. So we can say movies $, then we'll put this pipe operator async as movies. So what this essentially will do is it will take an observable list of movies, which we'll look at in a moment. It'll use the async pipe to unwrap that observable, and then Angular handles the subscription for that observable. It will unsubscribe automatically, and so on. And then we'll have access to this movies inside of the li. As a result, we can say movie.name. But of course, we haven't actually defined that movies $. So we'll save this file, and then we'll head over to the MovieList component. We'll then, inside of the constructor, we want to say private movie service of type movie service, and this will inject that movie service. We can then say that movies $, is going to be an observable of movie array, and then on ng on init, we'll firstly make sure we actually import this from RxJS and our movie model. Then we can say this .movies $, is equal to the movie service .getMovies. And once we do that, we can see all of our movies here on screen. So once again, that might have been quite a lot to get through in order to get that movies on screen right now, but the sort of ease of access of observables is the sense of we can unwrap it with this async pipe, and as far as we're concerned, we're not necessarily bothered about how we get those movies. It just comes down an observable stream, with then it displaying that information here on screen as a movie name. We can now display the image for that particular movie. As an example, we can say image and bind onto the source using the square brackets and say movie.image. So now we should have all of the different images for each movie. Obviously, right at this moment, we don't actually have these styled, so they will be excessively large, but we can change that in a second. So if we head over to the MovieList component.scss, we can say for the image we want a max width of 200 pixels and a height of 400 pixels and an object fit of cover. When we do that, we should be able to now see these movies in a more reasonable fashion. We can say for the unordered list, we want to display that as a flex. We'll add the flex wrap equal to wrap. we'll add the margin of 0 pixels, we'll add some padding of 20 pixels, and 0 pixels. We'll justify the content to the center, and for each list item, we'll add some margin, and we'll say the width is going to be 200 pixels. So if we look right now, we can see that we have these movies on screen and they are in a list like so. It would be better now if we could select a particular movie and it would take us to a detail page. So we'll simply put this back for now. We'll open up the terminal and we're already in this movie folder, and we'll say ngGC. We want to generate the component of the movie detail. So this will be a movie detail page. We'll then need to head over to our movie routing module, and inside of the movie routes we'll have to make some changes to our routes. So instead of simply saying path equal to this route path, we also want to add another path for :id. This will essentially wait for an ID to be passed to the route, and then when the ID has been passed, we'll say component equal to the movie detail component. So now if we select a particular ID, it will take us to that page. We'll need to make some changes, of course, to our MovieList component, and it's very simple. All we need to say at this point is now we want to surround this in an A tag, and we'll add a brackets for router link equal to the movie.id. This will now mean if we look at the navbar and we select an item, we can see movies 1. If we go back, select another one, we can see movies 2, and so on. So now we have routing between two different pages, but also at the same time routing based on an ID. And if we head over to our MovieService, we want to make another method, and this one will be called movie. It will take an ID as a number, and it will return an observable of movies.find. It will take in a movie, and it will return if the movie.id matches the ID passed in. That means we can head over to our movie detail component, and from within here we can inject the MovieService once more, and inside of ng on init we'll need to get the active route parameter. That will be the ID of this particular movie. So we can say private route of type activated route, and then we can say this.id, which we'll need to specify as an ID number, is equal to plus this.route. And I will just say as well, I didn't explain that on the MovieService. The reason we're adding this plus before the movie.id and the plus ID here is that it will convert any strings to a number. So we'll do the same for the route snapshot, because this will most likely be a string. So we can say route.snapshot.param_map.get, and we want to get the ID param, and that matches our movie routing module. We can see we have this ID parameter here, and then we can, inside of our movie detail component, we can have a subscription to the movie. So we'll look at how to get the subscription inside of a component. So we'll say movie sub $ is type of subscription, and movie is type of movie. So we'll need to import subscription from RxJS and movie from our movie model. And if we scroll down to ng on init, we can say this.movie sub $ is equal to the MovieService.movie. We'll pass in the ID, and then we'll subscribe to that observable. So we'll watch that stream. Anytime we get a movie, we'll set the movie equal to movie, and also we'll log this out to the console for now. With the developer console open, we'll select a movie, and we can now see we have information about that movie. So we've got the ID of 4, that's the one we selected. We can check that inside of our URL here. We see movies/4. We can go back, we get the same for 2, and so on. Whenever we have a subscription like this, we are using the subscription type, and we're going to implement something called onDestroy. That will need to be imported from Angular core. And if we scroll down to the bottom here, we can say ng on destroy. That returns nothing right now. And we'll say this.movie sub $ movie.unsubscribe. This will clean up any subscriptions, such as the one here to the MovieService, whenever we are no longer using this component and the component has been destroyed. We don't have to do this when we use the async pipe, such as here inside of the MovieList component, because Angular handles that automatically for us. So I'd like to talk about something called container and presentational components. The container component can be thought of as our MovieDetail here. Maybe we're doing some work, we're subscribing to an observable, we have the data, but we haven't yet shown it. In order to show that data, we're going to pass in the movie as an input to another component, and that component is only going to be concerned with presentational state. It isn't going to have state of its own, it's simply just going to display what is being inputted. So if that doesn't make sense right now, it hopefully will in a moment. We'll need to, of course, create a new component inside of the movie folder, and we'll go ahead and create an ng-gc of movie. So that will be a new component simply called movie. We could put this inside of a sort of presentation/movie if we wanted to, but I want to keep things simple for now. This will automatically be updated inside of the movie module.ts, but we don't actually need to add this to any routes, because we aren't going to be routing to this component specifically, but we will need to make sure it's added to the declarations. So inside of the MovieDetail component.html, remove the paragraph tag, and instead we'll say app movie, and we want to pass in the movie. So that's done by heading over to the movie.component.ts, and we'll import from Angular core something called input. We'll say at input, we'll add the bracket that's known as a decorator, movie of type movie. And when we input a movie into this movie component, we'll of course have access to that inside of the movie component.html. So we can make a div, and inside of the div, we can have an image equal to the source of movie.image. We can have a h1 of movie.id dash movie.name. This is just some information about the movie. You can do underneath that, we'll have a h2, and that will actually not be img, that will be image. Underneath that, we might want to show the genre and maybe the release year. So that's some information about the movie, and we're getting this movie passed in from the MovieDetail screen. Let's save our MovieDetail and movie component and pass in a movie with the brackets like so. We'll say movie is equal to movie, and that's the one that we get from our subscription. And then we'll need to make some CSS changes, because when we save and we click into this particular movie, it will be very large. So we'll put an image with a max width of maybe 300 this time. We can also at the same time do a media query where we have a max width of maybe 640 pixels. In that circumstance, we can have a max width of 200 pixels. We can also add some rules for the div, maybe have a margin top of 20 pixels, a display of a flex, the flex direction of a column, and finally we'll align all the items inside of the center. Let's save and see what we have. So now if we take a look, we can go back through and we can see that we have a variety of different information that we can see about each movie. We may want to change the size of that h1, it is quite large. So we can select an item such as that, and we can say h1. Maybe we want the font size to be 30 pixels or even 22. We could change the h2 to be a font size of maybe 18 pixels. I am actually quite zoomed in, so that's the reason that we're doing that right now. But you should be able to get an idea of how this works. So we have a little bit of a problem, that right now we don't have a specific navbar for each page. Right now we just say home, and it doesn't update when we're on a sort of detail view. There are multiple ways we can change this and work with that, but we'll head over to the navbar folder. So we'll cd into source, app, and then navbar. And from within here, we can generate a service under services/navbar. And we'll be using something called a behavior subject to update the navbar inside of each component. So we can now head over to the navbar service.ts, and we have a title, which is a behavior subject of type string. And inside of the constructor, we can set this.title as a new behavior subject, and we'll set this to movie night. That's all we need to do for our navbar service. we can now head over to the navbar component.ts, and inside of the constructor, we can inject the navbar service in the same way as we've injected the previous services, and we can set a title dollar equal to this.navbar service.title. We can then head over to our navbar component.html, and we can change the title from saying home to instead we'll have a binding to the title dollar piped into the async pipe. The behavior subject gives us an initial value. We can then give new values to this title using the .next. So we have movie night right now. If we select a sort of movie right here, it still hasn't updated because we need to add that functionality. So that's what we'll do next. And that means we'll need to head over to our MovieDetail component. And inside of here, we can inject the navbar service like the same way as each of the other times. And when we have the navbar service, we can say this.navbar service.title.next. And we can pass in the movie.name. So like I said, there's multiple ways which we can handle this in a production application. But for now, you can see we have, when we select a new item at least, the navbar is updated with that appropriate text. If we zoom out to 100%, we can see everything is quite small because I've had everything zoomed in. But we can see that the navbar text appropriately is sized inside of the navbar, and each time we select a new item, it gets updated. Now it doesn't get updated here on the MovieList screen, and that's because we're only setting the MovieList once. So we'll have to go to the MovieList screen itself, the component, and we'll have to inject the navbar once again. So say private navbar service. We'll make sure to import that. And then on the ng on init, we can say navbar service.title.next. We'll pass that movie night. So now when we go back, it should update that URL, or rather update the navbar text to say movie night. So this works currently in our situation, but I can think of a few ways in which we could do that differently. We have the basis for our application. I want to add a HTTP layer to this so that we can get information, or we can get movies from a HTTP service. So we'll go ahead and we'll create what's known as a db.json. So inside of source, or rather, actually not inside of source, inside of the root of the application, we'll make a db.json, and that will be a JSON file, which will act as the database for our application. I'm going to paste in some movies, and we'll see that just like so. We have a movies, which is an array, and it has our movies once again. I think it has a couple more at the bottom here, such as John Wick 3, Avengers Endgame, and so on. So we'll save this, and then we'll use something called json-server. So we'll need to go back to the root of our application, and we'll install using npm install json-server, and we want that inside of our project. We'll also need to make sure we add that as -d, and that will install as a dev dependency. And inside of package.json, we can go ahead and add a script inside of scripts for API, and that will go ahead and start our API by saying json-server db.json. So we should now be able to say npm run API. This will go ahead and start JSON server, and as you can see, we have this localhost 3000/movies. We should be able to make a GET request to this like so, and it should return us the movies, as we can see here on screen. It's just about now getting these inside of our Angular app to display. So let's head over to our app module firstly, and inside of the imports we'll have a HttpClient module. This is necessary because we want to use the HTTP client that comes from Angular Common HTTP. So we'll add that like so. And then inside of our MovieService.ts, we want to import inside of the constructor, so we want to inject rather HTTP as HTTP client. So once again, that comes from Angular Common HTTP. We'll then have a private root URL, and that'll be equal to the localhost 3000/movies. So that'll be our URL, and we can either keep these sort of two methods or delete them. It's entirely up to you. And we'll say get movies from HTTP. We'll return this.http.get we want to return a movie array, and we'll say this .root URL, and that should, we'll need to import movie as well at this point in time, and that should allow us to get those movies. And this will return us an observable of movies. So we can see inside of our movie list, if instead of saying get movies, we now say get movies from HTTP, and we save the file, we should be able to see that we have things like John Wick 3, Avengers Endgame, and Captain Marvel. And it was super simple. We didn't really need to do anything because we were using observables in the first place. If we select Captain Marvel as an example, it currently won't work because when it looks for that movie information, it does come from that movies file. So let's, inside of the movie service, let's make another function. This time it will be called movie from HTTP. It will take an ID of number, and we'll return this .http get once again. This time it will be a movie, and we'll pass it the root URL, and we'll use what's known as template literals here. I have a sort of video on that you can check out on the channel, /ID. And now in the MovieDetail page, we can say .movie. Instead, we can say movie from HTTP, and when we save the file, we'll instantly see Captain Marvel. So now we have this project that works entirely via our REST API, and I suppose the next best thing is to add a movie to this list. I'll be using something called reactive forms in Angular, and we'll also be using HTTP post. Let's now head over to our navbar component, and we'll add ourselves a button. So in the navbar component, we'll have a button, and that will simply say add, and we'll need to, inside of the navbar component.scss, we'll need to change up nav to instead display as a flex and justify the content to be space between. I'll put the add on the other side of the navbar, just like that. And for the button itself, we can make that a border of 0 pixels. We can give that a background gradient just like before. We can perhaps add the font size of 18 pixels, the color of white, maybe give it some margin right, a height of 50 pixels, a width of 100 pixels. Let's take a look at that. Not too bad, maybe too big, or maybe we're too zoomed in perhaps. Let's have a look. So let's put the height to 30 instead. Maybe 40, we'll say 40. And once we have that, we can maybe add a box shadow. So we'll say box shadow 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 0 pixels, black. Gives us a nice little box shadow there. We can say hover, so we want to, whenever somebody hovers on top of this, we want to change the border radius to be 0 pixels. That must mean we need some border radius to start with, such as 10 pixels. See how that looks. So now we hover, it gets rid of that radius. We can maybe change the background to be black. We can invert the box shadow, so make that a sort of teal color. And then we can add a transform of translate Y of -2 pixels in scale of 1.1. So also jump off the page a small amount. We'll finally add a transition of 1 second, and we'll add a cubic bezier for that. So we'll put that one on ease out. If we hover, you can now see we have this animation when we hover over the add button. You don't have to add this. I mean, is it even necessary? Probably not. But it's more so just to give us some styling options, I guess. We can add a tiny bit of margin to that H1. Perhaps we can add 5 pixels. That'll put it more centered in that navbar. And now when we zoom in a little bit more, everything should look normal. So we now need to create ourselves an add component. Open up your terminal, and inside of here we'll cd into source app movie, and inside of movie we'll say nggc for generating a component, and we'll call this component the add movie component. So now that we have this add movie component, we can go ahead and add it to the movie routing module. We can say the path of add is equal to the component add movie component. So it's important that we put it on top of the ID here, because that will be matched prior to the MovieDetail component. If we put it below this, such as like so, it would match the ID first and it would never hit this add path. So let's put it above that. This is not bulletproof either, because it may now, if we had a movie called add as an example, it would obviously not show the ID. So something to think about. We can then head over to our navbar component and we can add a router link of /add to the button. When we do that and we hit add, or rather that should be movies/add. Then finally, when we hit add, we should see add movie works. So we can go and now select add from any one of the pages and it takes us to that add movie page. Now inside of this add movie page, we're going to look at adding a form. So in order to do that, we're going to need to import what's known as the reactive forms module into our app module.ts. So let's say reactive forms module, and also import from @angular/forms. We want reactive forms module. And inside of our add movie component, we'll go and create ourselves a movie form equal to a new form group. Form group comes from Angular forms at the top here. Then inside of the form group, we'll have an object which says name, and that's a new form control. We'll set the state of the form to simply be empty. And then we can add an array of validators.required. This here would be a list of validation options, and we want to say that name is required. We'll go down and copy this for the rest of the properties, such as image, genre, and release year. We don't need to add one for ID, because ID will be handled for us by json-server. In our constructor, we can have a private navbar service of type navbar service. Inside of ng on init, we can set the title to be add movies. When we save that, we should then see add movies at the top, and we do. Then we can make ourselves a new function called add movie. We can check to see whether the movie form is valid. If it is valid, we can say our MovieService, which we'll need to inject. So we'll say private MovieService of type MovieService. That will need to be imported at the top, and we'll need to give ourselves a function to add a movie. So let's head over to our MovieService, and this will be quite an easy function. All we want to say is add movie. That will take a movie of type movie, and we'll return this .http.post. We want to post to the root URL and pass the movie. Simple as that. We can then say MovieService.addMovie. We can then pass the movie form .value. So that will be that object. We can subscribe to the result. And then after that, we can just assume for now that that will be correct. So we'll set movieform.reset, and then we'll navigate the user back to the home page. So we'll need the router for that. So let's say private router. We'll need to inject the router, and we'll say router.navigate. We'll put an object, or rather an array, with the slash. That will be simply the home page, and the router comes from Angular router like that. As far as our add movie component, that's simply just going to be a form. It's going to have a form group which we're going to bind to the value of our movie form. When the user hits submit, we're going to click the add movie. So we'll say add movie function just like that. We can then add an input of type text with the placeholder of name, and we'll give this the form control name of name, and we can go ahead and do this for the rest of our fields. Finally, we want to have a button which will be add, and we can make this disabled if the movie form is not valid. We can also make this of type submit. Now you may be noticing an issue at this point. We have this red underline, and I wanted to highlight something at this point. The reactive forms module isn't available, so we need to remove that from our app module. We then add that to our movie module as an import, like so. So we'll import that from Angular forms. And now when we hit add, we should be able to see our form. So why exactly does this happen? Well, the reactive forms module hasn't been imported into this module. We aren't using it inside of the app module, so we don't actually need it in that module. We only need it specifically inside of the movie module. So why does the HttpClient module not have this issue? Well, that's because our providers, so our services right here, are provided in root, like so, and Angular sort of handles how that works. So as a result, it has access to the HTTP client. Inside of our add movie component.scss, we'll have a form. We'll give this the max width of 500 pixels. We'll add some margin. We'll put that 0 auto, so that simply goes in the middle. Maybe add some padding too if we want. For the input fields themselves, we can give them some margin. Maybe set the width of 90% of the form. Get rid of the border. Set the font size to 18 pixels. Some padding of 5 pixels. And some box shadow. Gotta love a bit of box shadow. We'll set that to a red. We'll call it a movie night red. And there we go. We can see we have some form elements now. And finally a button. The button has a border of 0 pixels. It also has some padding, 10 pixels, font size of 18 pixels. We really should do this a bit better. But here we are, bootstrapping our movie night project. So that should be the ability now to add movies. We have to try this out with a new movie. So the movie we're going to add at this point is going to be Terminator Dark Fate. You can tell me from the future whether this was any good or not. And I imagine this is going to be an action movie released in 2019. So right now this hasn't been released, but when we hit add, we should see it inside of our movie night, and here we do. We can click it, we can see information about that. We can also check our db.json, and here we can see Terminator Dark Fate. Some other improvements to this, we may also want to not show that add button on the top when we're on the add screen. Doesn't really make sense. So we can go ahead inside of the navbar component, and we'll also need to inject the router into that. So say private router, and we can say the button to link the user to add only exists if the router.url does not include add or movie/add. When we spell includes properly and save the file, if we now hit add, we don't see the add button on the navbar. We might also want to add a router link to take the user back to the home page. So when we select add movies as an example, it takes us back, or even the Terminator right here, to the movie night homepage. So we're not doing too bad. We now have this movie night application. It does have the ability to view movies, to add movies. We can see the MovieDetail page. We've looked at routing, we've looked at presentational components, we've looked at smart components. We've looked at behavior subjects, observables with RxJS. So the final sort of stage to this would be to look at animations. We'll look at animations when we get our movies on screen, and that'll be done using Angular animations. So I've got now this movie.png inside of my source assets. That's simply a sort of placeholder movie. And we're going to introduce the concept of loading into our application. So inside now of our MovieList component, if we head over to that, we're going to have something called loading movies. And that's going to be an array of numbers. So there's numerous amount of ways in which we can do this. This is sort of tied to our current implementation. So this is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. It's more so just a sort of interesting example, just idea, playing around with a few concepts. We're going to now create a new array of 10 items. We'll fill that with nothing, and then we'll map over each item, which gives us the number and the index, and we'll simply return the index. So this here is just going to give us an array with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All it's essentially doing is creating an array of 10 things that we're going to map over in that sense to display 10 images. So don't really overthink this function at all. And then here inside of our MovieList component, make sure you've saved that. We can head over to the HTML file and we can say else loading. So we're going to say if we don't have access to these sort of arrays at this point in time, we want to display the loading template. And that's defined with an ng template. We can then give that a template reference with this hashtag and say loading. And we want to display the loading movies instead. So here would be a good place to sort of take this UL and LI and make that into its own component. But we're sort of going to be lazy right now. We're going to copy paste effectively most of the same code, and we'll say ng4 let movie of loading movies, and we will simply display the source of /assets movie.png. So we're not really going to see anything because it's going to load so quick on localhost. So what we need to do inside of our MovieService is give ourselves a delay. And we can add a delay quite easy. We can just add, we'll have something down the bottom here called add delay, and that will take an observable of any right now, and it will return the observable, and we'll pipe a delay of 1 second. So we'll need to import delay from RxJS. So that comes from RxJS /operators, and we'll have delay like so. On each one of our calls, so from get movies from HTTP as an example, we can pipe this .add delay. That will then add us a delay of 1 second, and as you can see those loading cards before we get the actual data. So now it's about animating this transition. It's about taking this sort of loading animation and adding that. So now we'll need to import the browser animations module, and that comes from platform browser /animations. We'll add that to the app module. We'll say browser animations module. We'll hit save. It still isn't going to make anything animate because we need to do that ourselves. But now this gives us the ability to head over to our MovieList component. And inside of the component metadata, we can say animations. We can pass a new array. We can have a trigger called list animation. We'll need to import that from Angular animations. We can then have a new array. That's the definitions of the trigger, in which we have a transition that needs to be imported as well. So all of these will be imported from Angular animations. The transition will go from anything to anything. We'll then query on the enter, so that's going to be whenever something enters. And we want to set the style to opacity 0, and we want to translate, so that'll be a transform. We want to translate y minus 50 pixels, and this will all make sense in a moment when we actually do the animations. And then we want to stagger, we'll add 50 milliseconds. And then we'll animate 500 milliseconds ease in to a style of opacity 1 and a transform simply to translate y 0 pixels. That's going to reset both the opacity and the translate y. So we're going to bring this in 50 pixels up, and then also at the same time we're going to come from an opacity 0 to an opacity 1. And that's going to stagger each one of these elements that enter by 50 milliseconds. So we're going to have this staggered effect. We're also going to have this fade in and the sort of come up effect. We'll also add optional true to this query animation as well. When the item leaves the DOM, so for example, when the sort of loading animation has been chucked away, we'll have access to a query for leave. So we can say query, but this time we're going to query leave, and we want to animate 500 milliseconds style to opacity 0 and a transform of rotate 90 degrees. Finally, we'll have optional true. So even though we've defined these animations, we still aren't going to get them on screen. So what we need to do now is head back over to the MovieList component and add the trigger of that list animation. So we'll say MovieList component.html. We'll have the unordered list, and then we'll have the brackets, and we'll say at list animation is equal to movies. And when we save the file, we should see that when the movies appear, they come in and they fade in from an opacity 0. As you can see, they sort of stagger by 50 milliseconds as well. So that's the movies that appear, but not necessarily the loading movies. Let's do the same for the loading movies. So we'll say list animation equal to loading movies. And now we can see that we have the movies that come in, but we don't have them on leave. So we need to say at list animation on the LI itself equal to that loading movies. Okay, so if we now refresh, we have information that comes in, it staggers, it initially loads, and for some reason It must just be because it's 1 o'clock in the morning here. But I can't actually work out why. I've tried pretty much everything at this point. Why it won't transition sort of out when the items exit the screen using leave. So I've copy pasted from pretty much the project I based this off, and it still doesn't work. But I guess at this point in time, you've learned how to use Angular animations. The animations themselves, they're not too bad. They stagger in, they fade in. They do exactly what we initially set out to do. So that's basically how to create a movie night application with Angular. Hope you found this useful. If you have, I'd love to know what you think inside of the comments section below. If you can spot the error that I've currently made with the query for leave animations, I'd be super happy if you could tell me inside of the comments. It's obviously too late here. I need more coffee. Thanks a lot for watching. Let me know what you'd like to see in the comments section, and hit that subscribe button and notification bell to stay updated with similar content like this. It's a longer form content than I usually do. It's a sort of deep dive into, or rather quick deep dive into, an Angular project. If you'd like this, I'd love to hear about it. Thanks a lot. Bye.